Again, I'm Jeannie Braha, the Executive Director of Rock Creek Conservancy. We are the Friends Group to Rock Creek Park and really thrilled to be continuing to partner with Rock Creek Park and our friends at the National Park Service to carry out this program that explores the intersection of race, history, and Rock Creek. And our goal is to find stories that are not shared as frequently and make sure that everybody hears about them. To bring together the thinkers and the historians and those who really understand these stories and can share them with us, but also to think about how we want our park and our parks and our world to be as we move forward. So thank you all for being with us this evening. I'm really delighted to introduce Ms. Kim Elder, who is the acting Deputy Superintendent of Rock Creek Park and carries many other responsibilities as well. And she is going to introduce our panelists and get us started this evening for the discussion of the U.S. colored troops and the Civil War defenses of Washington. Thank you, Kim.
Good evening, and thank you, Jeannie, and thank you to the Rock Creek Conservancy. I want to just say again, thank you and welcome to each and every one of you all who have joined us tonight. As Jeannie noted, we are in for a treat tonight. Lots of great information to share, history that is still evolving, and we can all be a part of it. So at this time, I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed panelists tonight. First, I'd like to introduce Stephen T. Phan. Steve is currently the Chief of Interpretation, Education, and Visitor Services at Camp Nelson National Monument. He has previously worked with the Civil War Defenses of Washington, Gettysburg National Military Park, Richmond National Battlefield Park, Hopewell Culture Natural Historical Park, and Rock Creek Park as well. A military history scholar of the Civil War era, Steve Phan's research focuses on military operational command, fortifications, and the Western theater during the Civil War. We have another colleague of mine with us on tonight, Dr. Noel López. Noel López is a cultural anthropologist with the National Park Service, National Capital Regional Office. Noel grew up and lived right here in Washington, D.C., DMV area. A former Baltimore City public school teacher, Noel holds a BA from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, an MLA from Johns Hopkins University, and is a current PhD candidate at George Mason University, where he is writing his dissertation on the political unity struck between the white urban Appalachians and the Black Panthers during the 1960s and 70s, and he has a story for you as well. I'd also like to welcome Emmanuel Dabney. Emmanuel is the curator at the Petersburg National Battlefield. A native of Southside Virginia, he holds a degree in historic preservation from Mary Washington University and a master's in history from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Without further ado, I want to get right into what I know will be a very, very interesting discussion. And we're going to first just start with talking about an overview of what is the Civil War Defenses of Washington. And then again, getting that perspective from our panelists. And I'm going to be chiming in a little bit as well. I probably can't help it. I am very connected to the Civil War Defenses of Washington. So I know that my colleagues on the panel won't mind me sort of interjecting a little bit tonight as well. But I'm going to start with you, Steve. Steve is very connected with the Civil War Defenses of Washington, having just left the Washington, D.C. area within the last 2 to 3 months. Steve, can you help us with a brief overview of what the Civil War Defenses of Washington is?
Good to see you, Kim. It's always a pleasure to reconnect, obviously. Yeah, I just moved to Kentucky to take this new position at this new National Park unit, Camp Nelson National Monument. But I basically spent the past 4 years at the Civil War Defenses of Washington with our office at Battleground National Cemetery, just north of Fort Stevens. So it's always a pleasure to talk about the defenses. And quite simply, they were a system of fortifications that was constructed by the U.S. military, army, and then civilians, even enslaved people as well, to protect the national capital during the course of the Civil War. Well over 60 fortifications and many other type of fortifications, batteries, rifle pits, military roads, things like that were constructed. Washington was one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world. If you think about the importance of the national capital, it makes sense with the Lincoln administration, the War Department. Really, the heart of the Union is in Washington. And we fast forward 100 plus years, 150 years. Now we have sites managed by the National Park Service and other entities as well. I know the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding area, D.C. and Maryland, manages 17 sites and a national cemetery, and used for all different types of, things now, from history to recreation. They're really green spaces in this urban center. So that's what we have here today. The image of Kim is the reconstructed Fort Stevens, probably the most famous site involving the defenses of Washington. So, and I think beneath the layers of the earthworks, the cannons, the walls, we have a lot of human interest stories, and that's what we really try to highlight at the defenses of Washington, especially the past several years, and we continue to do that. So that's a general overview, Kim, for all the listeners of the defenses of Washington. And I've got to do a shout out to our friend, Dr. Frank Cooling, the preeminent expert on the defenses of Washington. He's actually part of the video tonight, or part of the meeting. So it's good to see your face or your name on there. So I'll turn it back to you, Kim.
Okay, and so Steve, that's a great overview. Steve noted that it was one of the most fortified cities in the world. By the close of the war in 1865, there were 68 forts, 93 gun batteries, 20 miles of rifle pits, 32 miles of military road. Again, the nation's capital was one of the most fortified cities in the whole wide world at that time. And so I didn't know, before I jump right into some of the questions that circle around the Civil War defense of Washington and the United States colored troops, I wanted to find out if Noel or Emmanuel wanted to add any viewpoints from their perspective of what the CWDW means, even in their areas of research. Emmanuel?
Sure, I never pass up an opportunity to talk.
I know.
Talking too much has been my problem since I was born. I work, as Kim said, at Petersburg National Battlefield, a city that is sort of sleepy to a lot of Americans today, but it was not in the time of the Civil War. And in 1864, as military troops from both Confederate and Federal forces settled outside of Petersburg, additional Confederate troops were marching north through the Shenandoah Valley and ended up there behind Kim in this image at Fort Stevens. Troops were shifted from Petersburg to go meet the threat there at Washington, having already shifted troops away from Washington to assist in building back the forces in the Army of the Potomac, as they had lost heavy casualties leading down toward Richmond. As Washington was the most fortified city in the world by 1865, Richmond ran a close second, and Petersburg was that supplying city, getting goods to and through the Confederacy on its rail lines that really prompted Petersburg to end up wrapped up in this sort of military siege warfare with forts and artillery positions, miles and miles of earthworks, in which we are still finding where they were and how many there were today. And I'm looking forward to showing some of the connections further as we discussed about the roles of U.S. colored troops raised in the Northern Virginia area, in Petersburg, and broadly experiences faced by Black men, women, and children during this period.
Okay, well, thank you, Emmanuel. So Noel, we're going to get right into it. Who were the USCT, or the United States Colored Troops, and what was their significance?
Actually, before we get to that, let me just give a shout out to two people who preempted the work. And I just want to give sort of a little bit of background real quick on the work that we did. While Steve and Emmanuel are historians who worked diligently on the history, me as an anthropologist, the question that's been brought up to me was, are the communities that are surrounding the forts today associated with any of the Civil War defenses of Washington and the communities that were established back during the Civil War? and whether or not any of those communities were people who live there are descendants of some of the camps that were around these locations. And there were two main researchers I just want to give a shout out to right now, who were instrumental in the work in the research that we've conducted. One of them is Dr. Sue Taylor, who started off the phase 1 of the project, and started when we first prompted this question as to who should we be connecting with as far as descendants are concerned, whether or not we can find any sort of association with the communities that now live around these communities, like at Fort Totten or Fort Reno. And then secondly is Dr. Shander Manning from Georgetown University. And Dr. Manning's work has sort of piggybacked off of the research question that Dr. Taylor started off with. And actually, right now we're in the process of publishing the final draft of her report, and it'll be available on our on the local National Capital Area website for anyone who's interested in downloading it. So I just wanted to give that preempt with that and make sure that I put those people out there and let them know that really anything that I say is really based on the backs of the tremendous work that they have done. So I wanted to put it out there. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. And we're going to talk about some of the residents who were in those areas, some of the families and communities that were in the area as a result of finding refuges on these Civil War fortifications. So at this time, I just throw the question out to any of the panelists. Who were the United States colored troops and what was their significance?
Kim, I'll let Emmanuel answer the question about the U.S. colored troops, but I think you're right. We should start at the beginning. I mean, all the way back to 1861, when there are troops being sent to Washington, volunteers by the tens of thousands being organized for military service. There were African Americans in Washington, D.C. that volunteered services. There was a gentleman that wrote to the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, and saying there are hundreds of loyal Black Washingtonians that want to serve and defend the Capitol. This is when the Capitol was under direct threat. There was, a small system of fortifications in Virginia, but that was about it. And so that was really kind of the start. Simon Cameron rejected that, by the way, and he said, we will not have any use of colored troops at this moment. And so one thing I like to talk about with the defenses of Washington, they evolve over the course of the war, or evolve, and so does federal policy as well. But at the root of this, Kim, is African Americans themselves who are coming to Washington. They're self-emancipating, right? We call them freedom seekers. Very early in the Civil War, as early as the summer of 1861, into the fall of 1861, into 1862, especially. And where are they going? Wherever the U.S. military is at, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting in Washington because we spoke about this as we met, as a kind of a pre-meeting to speak about specific terms, because we're going to see, we got defenses in Virginia and in Maryland. In Virginia, when enslaved people are seeking freedom in the federal lines, by late 1861, 1862, they're being accepted as contraband of war. Meaning, they're basically designated as property that's being used by the enemy to support their war efforts. So the army is confiscating so-called human property, right? That's not the case on the Maryland border, where there's a lot of fortifications, including Fort Stevens. And, Maryland is a border state, and, slavery is still intact, protected by the Constitution, but enslaved people are still trying to seek freedom in Washington. And they're running right into the defenses of Washington, which makes sense. It's on the outskirts of the city. You're going to run right into the U.S. military. And this is where you see the breakdown of really slavery, I believe. You see this kind of interesting relationship with the U.S. Army and enslaved people. So these people are refugees, actually. And I think a lot of historians are now calling, we're talking about Black wartime refugees, because they weren't contraband of war, right? And there were also still enslaved people in Washington themselves, right? And so I wanted to understand, find primary source of counts of enslaved people coming into federal lines. You can imagine there's not as much records of, from enslaved people coming into DC, especially from Maryland. But what we do have is regimental histories of the units that built and garrisoned the defenses of Washington. And they talk specifically about enslaved people coming into their lines. And if Elena could show one of the images that we have, I think it's incredibly powerful in many different levels, because this is Camp Brightwood. It's about 1 mile south of Fort Stevens. And it was really kind of a rally point for a lot of enslaved people, including very young children that came into federal lines. And then quickly they were hired on as camp servants, officer servants, laborers, and cooks and things like that. And you can see that image, Camp Brightwood, and they call them contraband, right? But they're really refugees. And you can see how young the men are. They're wearing federal uniforms too, which is another element of this as well. But they were, the status for refugees was very uncertain. There are several accounts that we have of enslavers, literally the slaveholders coming into camp and retrieving their human property and taking them out of camp. So that situation did happen quite a bit. And I'll mention really quickly before I turn it over to Emmanuel, when the fences evolve in 62 and 63, when they're enlarged, they add more forts, that's when you're going to see a lot of formerly enslaved people, hired on in a way as civilians to build the defenses of Washington or expand them at least, and work for the U.S. military as well. And I found reports from the War Department requesting that, contrabands from Virginia be sent up to Washington to work on the defenses of Washington and even the defenses of Harper's Ferry, right? So think about kind of just like the span of this. It's quite large. The reach of slavery and military necessity is, it really runs across the country. And with that, I'll turn it to Emmanuel to talk about the U.S. colored troops.
Emmanuel, also define, because we're using a lot of different terms, and I want to make sure that everybody understands. So if you can sort of define contraband, because Steve doesn't use that term, although we know we've heard that term. So contraband as it relates to the United States colored troops.
Great, sure. So we'll start at the beginning with the contraband. Contraband is generally items, material that is being used by one adversarial force against another. And so the people who don't have the so-called contraband items are going to take control over them. So if anyone's familiar with early in the war, Winfield Scott, like me, a native Dinwiddie County resident, who has his history with the government was longer than mine has been thus far, but I think we'll be tied together by the time I retire. But his plan was to use the Federal Navy to reduce the ability of the Confederacy to get materials from foreign governments, because that material is guns, cannon, sewing thread and needles, uniform parts, food would be considered contraband. Using it to describe people had not been done before in US military history. And in 1861, in the spring, as Benjamin Butler, a strongly pro-war Democrat, and the Democrats in the 1860s are the Conservative Party. The Republicans run the gamut of their sort of political ideology at this point. But Butler receives, through the actions of 3 men who have escaped from Confederate Virginia into Fort Monroe, a federal occupied area in the Commonwealth. And these people, say that they have escaped from building earthworks for the Confederacy. And he is a lawyer as well, and uses this information to craft a very carefully worded rebuttal to Confederate officer who wants these people back. And he calls these escaped men contraband of war, and that he is not going to return them because they are being used to do harm against the United States and its army. And it does not take long for the word to get out that this place in Eastern Virginia is not sending people back into slavery. And so it started out as 3 people, turns into dozens of people, hundreds of people, and then by the end of the war, there are thousands of people who have flooded into not just Fort Monroe, but Hampton, Virginia, once it was fully occupied by the Federal Army. And this policy of contraband war continued to be applied throughout the South during really the remainder of the war. But it is Black people's desires to be free that sort of forced the government to do something very early in the war. Early in the war, it was not a universal policy to respect that people who wanted to be free were coming into federal lines, and many folks were sent back, and so some of the same folks escaped again, despite being severely punished, threatened by the people that had captured them or had once owned them. As sort of 1862 develops and federal armies get further into the South, deeper into areas where there are lots and lots of Black men, women, and children who are now fleeing toward them, there's a humanitarian crisis that really develops, and great literature out now. Amy Taylor's book about refugees, Black refugees in the wartime South and the issues that they face, if you're interested in reading some more from one source. But there was, as Steve said, this desire from several Black people to be involved with the military defense of the United States of America from the onset of the war. They had been denied technically since 1793 through a Militia Act. The US Navy had always sort of done things differently because they never had enough people, white men, that is, in their viewpoint, to join. So wherever they picked up people from wherever in the world was sort of fine with them. But it wasn't an accepted policy by the government. In 1862, after the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg, Maryland, President Lincoln, who had spent the summer working on a preliminary emancipation document, will release this preliminary sort of threat to the Confederacy about emancipation in areas under rebellion. Did not apply to areas that were in the Union, but still slaveholding, like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware. The District of Columbia had just recently done a compensated emancipation, and during the spring of 1862, which went into effect on April 16th, initially a supplement to that in July of 1862 for a really transformational, the second one, that it allowed Black people to say to the government that they had not been emancipated and they were residents of the District of Columbia. And so they could then advocate for themselves, really for the first time in a court of law, that they should not be enslaved. So DC was sort of out of the Emancipation Proclamation altogether. But the revision between the September 1862 preliminary release and the January 1863 final document is this sort of elements at the end that allows for the first time for the US government to officially recognize and recruit and use Black men in military service. There had already been a couple of regiments raised in the summer of 1862, unauthorized by the Federal War Department. Nevertheless, the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry and 1st South Carolina, the federal and Black unit of that group, were raised and were already in combat in the fall of 1862. But we get this official recognition in 1863. And it's partially pushed by abolitionist leaders. It's partly by anti-slavery governors. It's partly from military necessity to deal with all these Black men who are now behind Union lines and need to be fed and clothed, housed. And there's, in this era, there's a lot of hesitancy about having dependency amongst really anybody. And so having people be perceived as idle was not acceptable to the federal government. And so what ends up happening is we get these United States colored troop regiments. And they were officered by white men because they were believed to be better prepared to lead men into really their intent was to be used in defensive purposes. As 1863 through the end of the war progressed, we'd see more and more actual battlefield use. But Black men could be non-commissioned officers, sergeants, corporals, that sort of thing. And of course, the privates who were doing a lot of the work of military service. And this is pretty much how it remained for the rest of the war. There were very few Black officers in the war. Very few of them were involved in military combat. Many of them have sort of non-combatant roles. But the US colored troops by the end of the war comprised about 10% of the total US Army. We have 180,000 Black men in service with the Army, not counting those approximately 19,000 who were serving in the US Navy. And they fought in a variety of places and battles, 135 infantry regiments, so the men with the muskets who marched on foot, served in cavalry regiments. It's about 12 heavy artillery regiments, so the people who man big cannon, like bigger than one that's behind Kim there in that image of Fort Stevens, and a few light artillery batteries scattered throughout the South. And where Steve is working at now at Camp Nelson in Kentucky was a big recruiting station late in the war for them. But right outside of DC, on what was then perhaps more popularly known as Mason's Island, today's Theodore Roosevelt Island, was a recruiting center for the first United States Colored Infantry. And later, after that unit was fully formed and sent out to the front, became a refugee camp for many people who were fleeing slavery.
So Emmanuel has provided us with a wealth of that history of the United States Colored Troops. I am so appreciative of we've answered a number of questions, and we want to make sure that if you have questions or you need some clarification, to place those questions in the chat box. We're going to take a moment to get to those questions. But you talk about USCT, and we want to bring it back now just a little closer to home in Rock Creek Park, and specifically at Fort DeRussy. I know that before Steve left, he had some images, he found some images, he talked to some people who actually had evidence that there were USCT right around the corner in Fort DeRussy, just off of Military Road. I just wanted to take a moment to, Steve, share that bit of history. And of course, Noel, at any time you just want to jump in, and Emmanuel, I know, like me, we're all interpreters. We want to talk, we want to share. So feel free to interject where you need to interject, but I wanted to make sure that our audience knew of the connection and just how interwoven in USCT were with the Civil War defenses of Washington, because oftentimes people think of them, again, out in Kentucky and in Virginia, but not in Washington, D.C., because those kind of things, we just didn't have that going on in Washington, D.C. So Steve, speak to the USCT
and I'll speak just quickly.
Yeah,
just because I'd like to obviously hear Noel's insight as well. But Elena, if you could show the image that I have in my background, it's one of the most famous images of African-American soldiers during the Civil War. It's actually my favorite image of Black soldiers for a number of reasons. But as Emmanuel was talking about, really 1863, you're going to see the formation of the United States Colored Troops, organized by the the Bureau for Colored Troops, right? So it really is the federal government that's organizing these regiments. And a lot of them were organized in 1863. And so unlike a lot of the white regiments that have been serving for 1 or 2 years, they've got an extended amount of service left. And that includes some of the regiments that we see in the defenses of Washington, in Kentucky, and some that go and fight in Virginia where Emmanuel's at and beyond. They serve until 1866 or 1867. So, so let's talk about Washington, D.C. I mean, the defenses of Washington are garrisoned until really March, April of 1866, so long after the Civil War. 20 forts were kept around. They called them They designated them as first-class forts. And so what you're going to see happen in really the end of summer, into the fall of 1865, a lot of the white regiments will be mustered out of service. And then you're going to have units like this. This is the 4th United States Colored Troops, I think Company E. They were organized in Baltimore, Maryland, and they still had service to do, right, to complete their terms of enlistments. And so this regiment, along with some other regiments, you'll see them in the defenses of Washington in Virginia. But what I love about this image is that it's at Fort Lincoln in Northeast DC near Bladensburg. But just going through the regimental history, you know, each regiment has up to 10 companies of men. And so what the Army does, what they did throughout the war, you wouldn't assign an entire regiment to garrison one fort. They would just divide them. You know, companies would be sent to this fort, that fort, another fort. And so what we know that the 4th USCT was actually, and I know you're going to appreciate this, Kim, they were at Fort Reno. They were at Fort Tarusi. They were at Fort Stevens. They were also at Fort Totten as well, obviously as well as Fort Lincoln. So imagine, you know, several sites that we manage in the National Park Service. We know the 4th USCT was there, including Fort Stevens, you know, the site of the famous battle in July of 1864. And these units, including some units, as I said, one of the units of 107th USCT is from Louisville, Kentucky. They serve in some of the forts in Northern Virginia, and they're going to be some of the last troops that will be in the defenses of Washington before the forts are basically deactivated in 1866. So this image, I'll say one more thing about it. It's November 1865. So think about how late that is, right? Months after really the main surrenders of all Confederate armies in the field, right? The major hostilities are over, but they wanted to maintain a presence to protect the city if necessary and have troops on hand. And the troops that were on hand were United States Colored Troops.
And as you were sharing that, all I could think of is Frederick Douglass's call, you know, men of color to arm. It's time to report for duty. It's time to take charge of our own destiny. So again, we just wanted to make sure that we kept the context of, you know, the Civil War, the defenses of Washington, D.C., that all this is going on. We talked a bit about, you know, the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act, and this USCT all over the Civil War defenses of Washington. Since we're already past the war now, just want to kind of make sure that we continue to stay on the same sort of things. After the USCT's military service ended, where did the people go? What happened? What happened to them?
So that's the work that, Kim, you said at the beginning that we need to keep doing. And we need to keep doing it. One issue that I think is important to keep in mind is that most of the U.S. colored troops who served during the Civil War had lived in the areas in which slavery was legal and accepted and common practice. Like, it's not like people, not that there's ever been a ton of Black people who lived in Maine, but it's like it's areas that had a high Black population. And so those people often are going to return back home, and maybe not to the exact place in which they had come from, but to an area that was familiar to them. There is, the Civil War brings emancipation. And I think that it's important for us to think about how we use our words. People then may have said freedom, but we may not think of it as the same. And I think that for Black veterans, that is complicated because they had left family members behind. In many cases, because of the great divide in educational status, there's no means in which they can communicate with people in which they had left behind. And yet they know that things could have happened to these people, parents, grandparents, siblings, cousins, friends, neighbors, folks that they socialized with, were married to, disagreed with, like this whole world that we sort of occupy our life, they also had these lives, except the war sort of uproots the world in which they had known before slavery and after slavery. And as Steve said, these military units, they served well after the summer of 1865, when Confederate land forces were all surrendered or further dispersed. Many of them were sent from a part of my battlefield at Petersburg, Grant's headquarters at City Point Unit. By this May of 1865, Grant is gone north, but there's still a big shipping operation. Now it's gathering US colored troops and sending them to Texas to guard the border between Texas and Mexico due to French invasion of Mexico. But just all this movement that has happened, and for a lot of these people, they have moved more than they've ever moved in their life, and now they have to like get back to wherever their family is. Of course, a lot of people move on. They don't go back to where they had lived, and so it's hard to sort of track them in census records since they didn't go back home. Many of them still can't read and write, and so we have to. We talked about this in our sort of pre-planning of what to say about all of this stuff in a short period of time, but we have to put on our genealogy caps and use our historian hat as well. And I don't think that they are separate things. I was on social media before this and I saw people arguing about whether genealogists and historians can get along and are we really doing the same work? And I was like, is this for real? But we do have to do that. And I think one of the biggest challenges that face us for documenting what happened to Black Civil War soldiers after the war is, especially for those people who had left slavery, the use of false names to serve. So if they ever were captured, it would be difficult to trace where they had come from to return them to their former owner, which is something that Confederacy had, when they bothered to capture Black soldiers, invested energy into publicizing the capture of people and their names in newspapers in hopes that former owners would come and retrieve their so-called human property. And so, one of the people who served in the first U.S. Colored Infantry, a veteran of Petersburg campaign, enlisted as Robert Sitterman, but his real name was John Connor. And it's only through his pension record that information came out. And it took a lot of other people testifying that Robert Sitterman and John Connor were the same person. But if you didn't know to necessarily look in a pension record, you wouldn't know that you needed to go find Robert Sitterman in the enlistment record. And so when people start going back to former names or continuing to use their newly adopted name, it does make it challenging to sort of piece together their lives, but it is not impossible. It's just a lot of fragments of information. I spent too long last night looking at the Freedman's Bank records, and there are tons and tons and tons of Black veterans who open accounts in Washington, D.C., who had enlisted in Kentucky at Steve's current place of employment, but now they're living in DC and they're opening a bank account there. And it's like, oh, there's a little fragment of where they are, at least for a moment in 1866 or 1867 or in the late 1860s, early 1870s.
Sort of following along on that topic of movement, the research that we did when the question sort of that was postulated, as I mentioned at the beginning, was whether or not the communities that lived alongside the Civil War defenses of Washington today, established African-American communities, whether or not we could find or trace it back to the Civil War period, and whether or not there were anyone who was a member of those communities that could sort of trace their memory or their history back to that and remember that. And it goes back to, specifically what Emmanuel was bringing up, which is sometimes we ask the wrong question. And we did this project in 2 phases. And phase 1 was we had the wrong question, which was asked, which was we were assuming that the people that were alongside those communities or the civil war defenses today would be the exact same people. Like without moving, they would be the descendants of families, that could trace it back. And initially, the first project we sent people out into the world to interview people in the neighborhoods. And it became extremely complex and difficult to even be able to piece it together because you're essentially moving in the wrong direction. And Emmanuel hit the nail on the head. What we need to do is work as genealogists, which is working with the established records of the historical period and slowly move methodically through record after record until we can maybe make a connection. So one of the interesting things is, further up in the chat, you can see there's a link to the story maps that Chandra Manning's students had created. And one of the more interesting topics that they tackle, because the question, since we had to strip it all back, was to sort of like, let's start with a baseline and see what movements in the city for African-American, for free African-Americans moving around the city, what that looked like during the war. And what we found, or what was found by the researchers, was that that African-Americans, even if they were well established, were often living in alley houses. They were living in boarding houses in these other locations, and it was constantly in flux. So during the war, or during like a 6-year period or 8-year period, family members of the Ambush family, which were well established, recognized family in DC, African-American family in DC, family members were moving up to 6 and 7 times in that period. And so it just shows you the complexity of being able to even trace or track where people were. And this had to do with the fact that, the powers that be were putting people in these marginal spaces that were constantly being under attack and being eroded. And so, as we looked at this family, even the most established person in that family during that period had moved a total of 2 or 3 times. So it just shows you that, and these were Washingtonians. So you can only imagine people who were coming from elsewhere, from Kentucky, from southern states, moving northward, who arrive in DC, and who don't have established, they're not a member of an established community yet. After the war, they're just moving back and forth from place to place. That's the work that needs to be done. And so the study that we did was the first batch of that, getting a sense of movement. And then the next step is to invest more money. So hopefully there's funding out there for us to really do the genealogical work that needs to be done to really get a sense of where people moved to and where people were. But it's not as easy as just picking up a book or walking directly to someone and asking, because it's scattered out there, and it's a question of pulling it all together and being committed. And so it's, hopefully, as I said, this report that comes out will at least lay some foundational work for people to work from. But it does, it's one of those where the work's cut out in front of us once we get a sense of what we're doing, and it's massive. So I'm sure that for years to come, 3 of us will be working on this topic till we are ready to pass it on to the next person.
Kim, I'd also like to add something, if you don't mind. I think in regards to kind of like, the uncertain future, and I like the idea of movement and how so much changes for these people over the span of 3 or 4 years, right? Talking about records and, primary source records and things like that. Fortunately, Emmanuel talks about pension records, which is really interesting because it's a great way to not only understand the service of the male, but also of the spouse as well, right? And so it's unfortunate I don't live in DC anymore, because I get these requests from Emmanuel to go to the National Archives to look up these specific USCT soldiers. But one thing I do want to mention is kind of the legacy of military service will extend after the Civil War. So a lot of the USCT soldiers will actually enlist with the regular Army, right? Not just the Bureau of Colored Troops, which is a separate entity, but the actual U.S. Army, which is reorganized, in 1866 to include, for the first time in American military history, 6 Black regular Army regiments, 4 infantry, 2 cavalry, later reduced to 4. We now know those as the Buffalo Soldiers, right? And a lot of these men were recruited in 1865, 66, and 1867, that late. And what I found, because I did that, I did a lot of research for the Buffalo Soldiers at Charles Young, is it was really by practical necessity for these men to enlist in many ways. And it was employment. The Army offered constant employment, obviously clothing and food, and they could also take care of their families. And the Army recognized that as well. Prior to the Civil War, out west, the U.S. Army Regiment would be at some sort of, Western outpost or a fort, and there would be a chaplain assigned to each post. After the Civil War, specifically with the Black regiments, they assigned chaplains to the regiments, and they were to provide religious and educational services. And so going through the records and just reading about, especially the first generation of the Buffalo Soldiers, a lot of them were USCT veterans, and a lot of them remained in the Army for 20 or 30 years, into the 1880s, or even the early 1890s. And I'll give one example. I went down to the went down to the Alexandria National Cemetery, and obviously there's a huge USCT section there, but there's also a section of 6 Buffalo Soldiers, and we were able to trace at least 3 of them. One of them had served in the first USCT and had enlisted at Mason's Island, and left the Army after the Civil War, and then re-enlisted with the regular Army, served out west, and then retired to Alexandria long after the Civil War, right? And so, we're fortunate that we have military records that we can kind of glean into. But I think Emmanuel makes a good point in regards to the name changes. But that said, we'll use the records that we have to kind of flesh things out and reveal as much as we can.
And I just want to add in here that Noel and many of his colleagues that he's noted earlier on in our discussion tonight worked tirelessly on documents and studies. The ethnographical study was done at Fort Reno and sort of ties into CWDW. Noel, at any point in the evening before we close, if you can just put that link in the chat as well. There's so much to learn, and again, like an onion, you can peel it back, and Emmanuel will tell you'll find more and more and more and more. I do have a few more questions. Then we're going to go right into taking a look at that chat and see if there are any questions for our panelists tonight. But wanted to just talk about, so we're closing up the war now. The war is over. We're still talking about the USCT, still very active, even beyond 65, 66, 67. How did the Reconstruction, how was Reconstruction even begin to shape, and what did USCT have as it related to America in its new phase of what now, after slavery, you've got Reconstruction? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Emmanuel, that is all you, sir.
All right. So I did drop a link in the chat a little while ago for mappingoccupation.org. There's been a lot of damage done to the American understanding of Reconstruction by white supremacist historians of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And one vision of that is the entire South was occupied by marauding Yankee white men, and, quite frankly, many people called them, rapists, in referring to US colored troops. That's not true. There are no total massive occupations of the formerly Confederate States of America in the aftermath of the Civil War. There are pockets of occupation. But what we do see, in part because of what Steve alluded to earlier, there are different elements to these Civil War armies. These state volunteer regiments, their service for some of them ended before the war ended. And for others, they either re-enlisted together in smaller clusters or new regiments that were formed as the war went on. Their military service, for the most part, ended with Confederate military surrenders. The United States Army's use of the men in the US colored infantry, cavalry, heavy artillery units, that's still open because of when those people made it into military service. And so a lot of the early phases of Reconstruction in the former Confederacy is a combination of white cavalry units and Black cavalry units and Black infantrymen who are largely positioned in cities, in sort of larger towns, and that the mounted force that cavalry gave them a bit more of a range of what they could get out into the countryside and provide assistance to white unionists, as well as formerly enslaved and free people who had been free prior to the war. But it's going to take a lot of work for, particularly for Black people, to get assistance from the Army. But the Army is essential to Reconstruction and sort of enforcing the law. The Southern governments are largely displaced in many cases. Folks have, escaped somewhere else. They're out of sort of political power. The Freedmen's Bureau, or the Bureau of Abandoned Lands, Refugees, and Freedmen, are going, is sort of a military operation in a way. And so they're the ones who are enforcing the laws. And that is critical to understanding what is sort of happening in the aftermath of the war. And that could do a whole nother talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. You can watch it on C-SPAN if you're interested. But as time goes on, white Southerners complain more and more about Black military presence. They want it gone. They, would prefer if all of it was gone. And as more and more states get readmitted to the Union in the late 1860s, they start to get what they want. And the military presence disappears as those states return into the Union. And so we really are sort of begin to squeeze the US colored troops away from even the nation's capital and further sort of out into Texas, or to go ahead and have the regiments leave military service. And we really see in the summer of 1865 an effort to curtail recruitment because of a perception that the war is over and we don't need any more soldiers to perform duties. There'll be times in different periods throughout the South where there'll be more federal troops that will be present than at other times, based on really the violence that white Southerners perpetrate on Black Southerners. But the early, the first year or two after Confederate military surrenders, US colored troops are going to be involved in enforcing emancipation, assisting white military officers in the Freedmen's Bureau, and ensuring that Black women are reunited with their children, that that the sort of vigilante law that had pervaded the South for decades was not going to be just ignored anymore by the federal government, even though the government always could have done more.
And as you noted, there's so much more. I often say, and thank you, Emmanuel, I often say, that people put Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, in a separate little box. Like, the nation's capital wasn't impacted with the issues that were surrounding the South with Reconstruction, but it was taking place right here in Washington, D.C., which now leads me to a question that I don't know if it's rhetorical. If you want to answer it, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and start with you, Noel. Who writes this history? Who writes this history? And a little bit further, who has a voice in ensuring that it's documented in history? who's writing this history? Who can write it? Who do you think should be writing it? I'll unleash that one to you, Noel.
Well, I used to work with a historian by the name of Dean Heron, and Dean would always joke that that the North might have thought it won the Civil War, but really, when you think about the history, the impact, and the way that the narrative was sort of put together, the South clearly has won the sort of the cultural one, and it continues to win. And I think that's very true. One of the things that I know that Steve and Emmanuel have both engaged in has been actively thinking about even the language we use when we're talking about African Americans, the Civil War, enslavement, etc. So far is a success of the South that we often will use rhetorically the terms that they were throwing around, including things like Yankees. We refer to things as, we don't refer to them as rebels, as sort of as people who were leaving, who were traitors to the nation. We frame it almost as if it's two equal nations that were battling it out. And that just goes to show the power of narrative that the South sort of took over. And a lot of that comes out of, not only the lost cause, but then a lot of the work that was done afterward or during that period of time with history books in the South that are, that have had an impact, outside impact on the way that people even think about what the Civil War was. You mentioned that DC sometimes exists as a bubble. DC exists as a bubble in many different ways, not just with African-American history, but Indigenous history as well, where all of these sort of rougher edges of what it is to live and be in America get smoothed out so that we can simply hold the ideals up without the reality that people lived in. And so oftentimes I find that a lot of our work reaches loggerheads with community members because it challenges their very view of what this country or what the city is and means. And unfortunately, this is the reality that many African Americans constantly know and are aware of. So it's never a challenge for them. It's a challenge for the people who sort of have accepted that smooth, version of our local history, of our nation's history as well. So I guess the question is, who gets to write it? I think, I'm a product of my era, and I think that the people in the margins are the ones that need to write and add to the version of history that we have. Because clearly the perspective that has been taken from a dominant perspective does its best to simply keep the ideology that it's existed, to keep the traditions going, without ever really thinking in more critical forms as to why we're in the situation we're in, how this happened. And I think, and unfortunately, that comes at the expense of having a much more truer conversation and understanding the motivations that people sort of exist within, the material conditions people exist within, to make real change in this country. So I don't know. I don't want to go into too radical conversation here, but I do think it's important to note that if without sort of the work of people challenging the narrative, we would still be telling a story that sounds more like a baseball game than anything else.
Yep. Exactly. Steve, Emmanuel, you all want to take a stab at who writes that history and who has the voice in documenting it?
I guess I'm gonna shift a bit in the sense of this program is being hosted by the Rock Creek Conservancy, which is the nonprofit partner of Rock Creek Park, which is a part of the National Park Service, right? And so, and I know Jeannie will appreciate this. I saw one of my friends post on Instagram a photo of like peak bloom in Rock Creek, and my comment was, man, I really miss Rock Creek, right? But I think we have to understand these spaces that we manage as well, right? I mean, we call them public lands for a reason, and that's really been kind of my inspiration. Really, when I first started with the defenses, I mean, I guess working with the defenses all the way back in 2016, 2017, was these spaces where we know this is a Civil War site, a historic site, right? And I think, when we had spaces like Fort Stevens and just all different places, other defenses of Washington, it's easy And I think it's, necessary to talk about the Battle of Fort Stevens, of course, but there's just so much more that we can learn about, just the human condition in many ways. As I mentioned, the intersection of slavery and freedom occurred in the defenses every single day during the Civil War. And then obviously the repercussions of that afterward. And so, that was kind of the way I approached this. So when I went out to Rock Creek and we did programs, we'd walk into Rock Creek, and it's obviously a beautiful urban oasis in Washington, D.C., but there are just so many layers of history we can talk about that we can review. I think, as Kim, we talked about this for years. It's our mandate really to amplify the voices that were there, right? Yeah. And so when people walk by Fort DeRussy, hell yeah, we're going to talk about the battle. We'll talk about the construction and the design, the remnant earthworks, but we're also going to talk about the four enslaved people that were on the property that was owned by Bernard Swart, right? He's the guy that owned the property where Fort DeRussy was constructed. And so, that's another layer that we need to review here, right? And I think we're able to do that at the Defenses of Washington, especially in Rock Creek and obviously across the river with the Anacostia side forts as well, right? And so I see this, if we're talking about like narrative and who's like really controlling this and stuff, and I think that's an argument that historians have every single day. But when people come out to Rock Creek Park, and I'm so pleased to be a part of this because I see, and obviously, Rock Creek Park, people out there for enjoyment, right? Recreation, just getting away, walking their dogs, jogging, enjoying nature, right? But if we offer, opportunities where people can really engage to the deeper meanings of what it means to be not only an American, but a human being, I think we're doing the right thing. And so I really stress that. And so I think this Race and History series is so important because, one of the things I always said, Kim, this, hey, come enjoy history in nature. And we would have people that had a natural background, natural resource background that, would say, I had no idea, that this occurred here. I didn't know there were enslaved people here. I didn't know there's U.S. colored troops here, that there's just so much we can talk about. And it's just an opportunity, we have to seize on these opportunities to have these meaningful conversations. And that's why, Rock Creek Park is beautiful, but it's also very complex as well. And we should embrace that. It's a challenge, but that's why we're here. What do you think, Emmanuel? Let me get off my pedestal real quick.
We like you on a pedestal. So I guess what I'll say is that I'll say a couple of things. One is inviting more people into the conversation is always going to get you more information. And so, if you're looking to do this sort of descendant community work of people that were once enslaved in Washington, D.C., who came to D.C. as a result of the Civil War, who served in U.S. colored troop regiments, if you're going to have to naturally just talk to people who often, not, none of them, but often, have not gone and gotten a PhD or master's degree and spent their days and nights fretting over footnotes in a book and begging your friends who used to live in DC and moved and didn't get my US colored troop research done for me. But anyway, so you have to sort of invite others in. And that's something that, quite honestly, the history community writ large has struggled with in the past. I think in the last, 30-ish years, it has gotten better at that. And there's ongoing work that sort of proves that, and yet there is always more work to do. The National Park Service has more work to do. And part of this sort of, getting other people, I think a group of people that have fundamentally had and have a very challenging relationship with others in this country are Black women and children. And the control over their movement, the control over their bodies, the control over their education has and continues to be a problem in equality and equity and access, but no one was asking the questions in the 1930s about what is Black women's relationship to the Civil War. It took a lot of revolution of womanhood in this country, access to education. Scholars are now asking different questions and have access now, getting PhDs and master's degrees and bachelor's degrees to do the work that is required to actually get some answers and to pose new questions that other scholars and community people and park rangers and all sorts of other folks that are interested in this can get involved with. And the last thing I'm going to say is that there have always been a group of Black people who have had access to some literacy, whether gained legally or covertly, who have been talking about Black experience in this country. Civil War veterans did that in their pension depositions, their widows and the representation for lawyers of their orphan children did that in these widow and orphan children pension requests. There were publications in the time period of the Civil War, like the Christian Recorder, where literate Black people who served in the US military were giving testimony to what their experiences was, good, bad, and ugly. One of my favorite people who actually served under a false name, George Washington Williams, his actual name, that's his actual name, wrote history books in the 1880s about the history of the Negro in the United States, 1619 to 1880. And then in the late 1880s wrote another book about the history of the Negro troops during the Civil War. And so they've been there. It's just sort of had this sort of counter run to the popular narrative. And popular for who meant that certain people got to get their textbooks reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. Many of us on this call already know about the separate and completely unequal education that Black people and others of color got in this country, whether they lived in the North, the South, East, middle of the country, or the West. And that, this has shaped what people know or don't know about the Civil War and Reconstruction especially. And those are really defining elements in our nation's history, as civil wars are in any nation's history.
Well,
Emmanuel, it sounds as if you're saying, which I like, that basically one of the sources that we have is Black people in their own words, and that we should be seeking that out to elevate their stories as much as possible when we're telling these histories. Is that essentially your thesis here?
I would say that is a critical element of it, and because I love things, I'm a museum curator. That one of the sources when we run out of words, when we can't find the words, we can find the evidence. It's often represented architecturally and how people construct buildings and cities and towns and plantations and farms. It is the archaeological evidence underneath the ground that may tell us about life in refugee camps or on plantations or in urban areas. So sometimes we have over-relied on words. We've looked for them in traditional places, especially amongst us who are Civil War military people. So we often rely on soldier or officer battle accounts to tell us about the battle. And we ignore all the pages that are associated on either side of that. Great work from someone that I just super respect, Dr. Tavolia Glimpf, in her latest book about women in the Civil War. There's a section in there towards the end of the book that is horrific. And I'm going to tease that I think you should go read it. So I'm not going to tell you what it was, but it's documented in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, the same book that or series of books, there's volumes of books that people obsessed with the Civil War have been looking at since the 1890s. And I was at a conference and someone asked her, why haven't we heard this version of the Civil War before? And, she accurately responded that she thought she had some ideas, but all she could say is it was in the same material that predominantly white Civil War historians of the late 1800s and early 1900s and mid 1900s and the 2010s, the 2020s have been using.
So I think we got Emmanuel was frozen, but I want to wrap it up, and we want to take a minute to again address questions and inquiries that we have in the chat box. But I do want to point out that Dr. Cooling has said it best. He said the best part of all of this is that it's a continuing process of education, and it takes open-mindedness. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Cooling. That did not slip by me at all. And again, I want to take a moment to thank our panelists. I think that you gentlemen have got your finger on the pulse. We're going in the right direction. You have shared a great deal of information for us, helped explain a lot of, the Civil War defenses of Washington, USCT, across Washington, D.C., across the country in a matter of just a good 30, 40 minutes. And I want to thank you again on behalf of Rock Creek Conservancy and Rock Creek Park and National Park Service for your work that you continue to do on behalf of this history and this continuing process of education and your open-mindedness. And so at this time, I want to take a moment. Jeannie, I'm not sure how we're going to address any questions that are in the chat box, but we do, I know we have a few questions and some comments as well. So are you and your team going to take this portion of to address the chat box? Okay, great.
Thanks, Kim. I don't see too many questions. There are some statements. There is still time, guests, if you'd like to add a question. We do have a comment. I appreciate your pointing out Mr. Cooling's question. We had somebody mentioned that a U.S. colored troop sculpture is to be unveiled this weekend in Wilmington, North Carolina. So that's planning trips for the winter. Perhaps you want to go see that. I will say there is a wealth of resources that our panelists have shared in the comments that I know the team here at the Conservancy will collect and put into resources that we'll share with everyone who's registered for the program, along with the recording of this. Mr. Cooling also shared Dudley Cornish as an early student of the Black military experience in the Civil War. I see some nods, so I'm going to assume that that's a resource. Just for the record, Mr. Cooling and others, you should never skip dinner to attend these events. The beauty of Zoom is that you can have dinner while you're observing it. Another comment was that the Black Seminole Indian Scouts was a group that needs to be mentioned. I don't know if any of you would like to just comment quickly on their role.
That's right. Yeah, we featured them a little bit at the Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument in Ohio, because several of them were awarded the Medal of Honor in actions after the Civil War and in the campaigns west with Native Americans. So, yeah, I think that's a part of it as well, right? Because when we talk about African American or just African or Black, that's kind of a very loose, generic term. I know I've discussed this with Emmanuel. Emmanuel is one of my great friends. Is I don't like the term Black community. Like, which one are you talking about? There's communities within communities, right? And so I think that's kind of important to kind of flesh out as well. And I would say this as well, Jeannie. I'm really proud to be the new Chief of Interpretation at Camp Nelson National Monument, because as I mentioned, and I'll mention this to all the visitors now, it's a U.S. Army base, supply depot, and it evolves to become a recruitment center for over 10,000 Black soldiers. The majority of them were enslaved and in the slave state, Kentucky, right? And it was also a refugee camp for freedom seekers. So their families in many cases. And as Emmanuel talked about, they were not treated often very well. We're actually doing a program on the 20th called it's for the expulsion. And it was one of multiple expulsions where the U.S. Army, literally drove people by the bayonet out of camp, enslaved people or refugees, and they ended up dying. Over 102 died in late November of 1864. And so, but this had national significance because there was legislation that came out of it because there were USCT soldiers whose families were driven from camp. Imagine that. You serve in the U.S. military, your family, someone in your family is a refugee, and they're not even afforded any sort of status. And, their situation can change in a second, which happened to many of these people. And so I guess the last thing I'll say is, just think about some of the sites that not only the Park Service is managing, but other across the country. There's a lot of, inspiring young historians that are really attacking this. We got Reconstruction era down in South Carolina, right? We've obviously got Camp Nelson. We've got some of the freedom riders and Medgar Evers down, further south Mississippi and things like that. Just think about where the Park Service is going in many ways, right? And so we hope that you can continue to come to these sites, follow us. Obviously, it's a mutual collaboration. We want to hear from you as well. So, yeah, thank you so much.
I'm just going to add that somewhat to Steve's latter point there is, when you go to your community historic site, community center that somehow props up history, the state park, the national park, if you are not seeing sort of the totality of the experience of people represented, say something. We all owe it to the people who existed in the past, those that we find interesting, those that we find deplorable, those that we find exciting, that people may consider heroes, others consider demonic, whatever their sort of relationship is to one another and to us personally, we owe it to the past, which I constantly refer to as the thing that I'm interested in. I am referred to as a historian, and I'm fine with that, but I wish that I could be a pastorian, because the past to me is the total accumulation of everything that has happened, whether we acknowledge it or not. History is often shaped by our access to information and what information we choose to prop up or not. And so, even, as we attempt to get the record right, we're really continuously, hopefully, at least in my vision of what it is that we're talking about, trying to get more to the past and a little bit less of the shaping of history over time as people celebrate and denigrate specific records to fit their biases.
And to continue on that, there should be, just to put it in more blunter language, there should be no interpretation of any of our spaces in DC that doesn't include African-American history as well. It is foundational, and also indigenous history as well. It's foundational to the landscapes, to the laborers, to the enslaved, to everyone who's been in these spaces. And so if you find, as Emmanuel said, if you find a park that doesn't interpret in a very broad way, or historical house or anything doesn't interpret in a very broad way their history, they need to maybe take some time and be reflective on what that history is that they're interpreting there, because there's no way that you can get around that, especially not in the DC area at least. But I'd venture to say anywhere else in this country, but especially here in DC. So I know that we here in the National Capital Area are committed, or we're trying to commit ourselves to this. It's there's no end goal ever, right? You never reach it. It's just a constant struggle. But right now, the struggle that we're putting a lot of our effort behind is to make sure that we tell these legacies, we use this term internally, legacies of enslavement and race at all of our sites. And so it's crucial that that's the direction that we're always moving towards for greater interpretation. So I commend the two gentlemen here because, and also Kim, this is the work that they've been committed to. And it's really reflected in the changes of interpretation that we've had in both the national capital area and then overall in the Northeast region. So kudos to you guys.
So Jeannie, before I turn it back over to you to close up, and I know you're going to be announcing our next event for this Race and History series, I did want to share, because Dr. Cooling's comments and so many of your other comments, that we need to do something like this in commemoration of the 158th, can you all believe it's been 158 years for the Battle of Fort Stevens that we'll be celebrating in July of 2022. And I would just note that I want to give a nice shout out right here, right now, to the Rock Creek Conservancy. Rock Creek Conservancy approached the National Park Service specifically here in Rock Creek Park and said we should be doing something on race and history in Rock Creek Park in northern DC area. And we sort of expanded. We started with events like Chocolate City, the discussion on the Chocolate City book. We've done everything from Chocolate City to Melvin Hazen, and tonight with the Contraband and USCT and Civil War Defense of Washington. And so if you have other ideas, if you definitely want to stay in tune, your registration tonight puts you on the invite list for next time. And then Jeannie's just put in the link in the chat, the link of this history that we're doing and uncovering our history. So this is not these aren't one-offs. We've been doing these now for a while, and we invite you to continue to take part in them and share and tell others about it. It looks like each one just gets better and better each time we do them. So again, on behalf of the National Park Service, I want to thank Jeannie and all the Rock Creek Conservancy, my panelists, my colleagues on this call tonight, each of you all who spent this afternoon with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeannie at this time.
Thank you so much, Kim. Yes, I hope that all of you and many more will join us on January 10th, where we'll be doing a history of Meridian Hill Malcolm X Park, which many people don't know is part of Rock Creek Park, but is indeed managed by Rock Creek Park. I want to quickly thank Elena and Lindstrom at Rock Creek Conservancy, who really helped make this happen, and I'm incredibly grateful to Kim and the rest of the leadership at Rock Creek Park, who have been amazing partners in this whole Race History and Rock Creek series and continue to be. We have a really exciting lineup for 2022. I could listen to Steve and Emmanuel and Noel and Kim talk to each other and just talk about anything for quite a long time. So I'm really delighted that we were able to come up with a good reason to do that this evening. I think it was Steve who mentioned the natural resources of Rock Creek Park and the fact that these historic resources are in a natural oasis. And Rock Creek Conservancy is the philanthropic partner to all of Rock Creek Park. And we are dedicated to protecting, restoring, and telling the story of all of those resources, which really are interconnected. All this stormwater that we've read about a lot may wash away some of these or damage some of these important cultural resources. And certainly if you're literally moving earth to protect the nation's capital, that has an impact on the landscape and the natural resources around that. So there's just no way to disentangle those. We are also, I should mention, as the Friends group of Rock Creek Park, we are dedicated to ensuring that the park has the resources that it needs to do that important work of protecting those resources, but also telling those stories. So Giving Tuesday is coming right up. Please, stick around and pay attention to the opportunities to help the Conservancy support Rock Creek Park in every way that we can. And I just want to thank our panelists. Kim as the moderator, but as when she's not acting as Deputy Superintendent of Rock Creek Park, Kim is the manager of the Civil War Defenses of Washington and is truly an amazing leader of that work, telling those stories and protecting those special places. Steve, he may have left the Civil War Defenses of Washington for Camp Nelson, but we know he'll be back. He couldn't get away all the way. He's with us tonight. Emmanuel, you are new to the Rock Creek family, but we know once the archives open up, you'll now have to come to your own research. So we look forward to having you in the park when you come for that reason. And Noel, we so appreciate the leadership that you give the region and the continued ideas and thought leadership that you're providing to this series of programming. I could go on for quite a while, but we have hit 7 o'clock, and I know that Mr. Cooling needs to go have his dinner. We wish all of you a fantastic evening. It is a absolutely gorgeous week, peak foliage in Rock Creek, and it's kind of unseasonably warm. So please go out and enjoy the park, maybe hike to a fort, soak it all in, think about what we could do better, and maybe take a peek at Meridian Hill and then join us in January for that. Look for an email later this week with a link to the recording and some of the resources that have been shared. And thank you all so very much. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. We appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Great
Thank
job,
you.
gentlemen. As always, great job.
Thank you.
I'm